Louis Philippe I was king of the French from 1830 to 1848 as the leader of the Orléanist party. His father Louis Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, had supported the Revolution of 1789 but was nevertheless guillotined during the Reign of Terror. Louis Philippe fled France and spent 21 years in exile. He was proclaimed king in 1830 after Charles X, of the senior Bourbon line, was forced to abdicate. His reign, known as the July Monarchy, was dominated by wealthy elite and numerous former Napoleonic officials. He followed conservative policies, especially under the influence of François Guizot in 1840–48. He promoted friendship with Britain and sponsored colonial expansion, notably the conquest of Algeria. His popularity faded and he was forced to abdicate in 1848. He lived out his life in exile in Great Britain. Before the Revolution. Early life. Louis Philippe d'Orléans was born in the Palais Royal, the Orléans family residence in Paris, to Louis-Philippe Joseph, Duke of Chartres, who became Louis-Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, and Louise Marie Adélaïde de Bourbon. As a member of the reigning House of Bourbon, he was a Prince du Sang. Louis Philippe was the eldest of 3 sons and a daughter, a family that was to have erratic fortunes from the beginning of the French Revolution to the Bourbon Restoration. The elder branch of the House of Bourbon, to which the kings belonged, deeply distrusted the intentions of the cadet branch, which would succeed to the throne of France, should the senior branch die out. Louis Philippe's father was exiled from the royal court, and the Orléans confined themselves to studies of the literature and sciences emerging from the Enlightenment. Education. Louis Philippe was tutored by the Countess of Genlis, beginning in 1782. She instilled in him a fondness for liberal thought. It is probably during this period that Louis Philippe picked up his slightly Voltaire brand of Catholicism. When Louis Philippe's grandfather died in 1785, his father succeeded him as Duke of Orléans, and Louis Philippe succeeded his father as Duke of Chartres. In 1788, with the Revolution looming, the young Louis Philippe showed his liberal sympathies when he helped break down the door of a prison cell in Mont-Saint-Michel, during a visit there with the Countess of Genlis. From October 1788 to October 1789, the Palais Royal was a meeting place for the revolutionaries. Revolution. Louis Philippe grew up in a period that changed Europe as a whole, and following his father's strong support for the revolution, he involved himself completely in those changes. In his diary, he reports that he himself took the initiative to join the Jacobin Club, a move that his father supported. Military service. In June 1791, Louis Philippe got his first opportunity to become involved in the affairs of France. In 1785, he had been given the hereditary appointment of Colonel of the 14th Regiment of Dragoons. With war on the horizon in 1791, all proprietary colonels were ordered to join their regiments. Louis Philippe showed himself to be a model officer, and he demonstrated his personal bravery in 2 famous instances. First, 3 days after Louis XVI's flight to Varennes, a quarrel between 2 local priests and one of the new constitutional vicars became heated, and a crowd surrounded the inn where the priests were staying, demanding blood. The young colonel broke through the crowd and extricated the 2 priests, who then fled. At a river crossing on the same day, another crowd threatened to harm the priests. Louis Philippe put himself between a peasant armed with a carbine and the priests, saving their lives. The next day, Louis Philippe dived into a river to save a drowning local engineer. For this action, he received a civic crown from the local municipality. His regiment was moved north to Flanders at the end of 1791 after the declaration of Pilnitz. Louis Philippe served under his father's crony, the Duke of Biron, along with several officers who later gained distinction in Napoleon's empire and afterwards. These included Colonel Berthier and Lieutenant Colonel Alexandre de Beauharnais. Louis Philippe saw the first exchanges of fire of the Revolutionary Wars at Boussu and Quaragnon, and a few days later fought at Quievray near Jemappes, where he was instrumental in rallying a unit of retreating soldiers. Biron wrote to War Minister de Grave, praising the young colonel, who was then promoted to brigadier, commanding a brigade of cavalry in Lucknow's Army of the North. In the Army of the North, Louis Philippe served with 4 future marshals of France: Macdonald, Mortier, Davout, and Oudinot. Dumouriez was appointed to command the Army of the North in August 1792. Louis Philippe commanded a division under him in the Valmy campaign. At Valmy, Louis Philippe was ordered to place a battery of artillery on the crest of the hill of Valmy. The Battle of Valmy was inconclusive, but the Austrian-Prussian army, short of supplies, was forced back across the Rhine. Once again, Louis Philippe was praised in a letter by Dumouriez after the battle. Louis Philippe was then recalled to Paris to give an account of the battle at Valmy to the French government. There he had a rather trying interview with Danton, Minister of Justice, which he later fondly retold to his children. While in Paris, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general. In October he returned to the Army of the North, where Dumouriez had begun a march into Belgium. Louis Philippe again commanded a division. Dumouriez chose to attack an Austrian force in a strong position on the heights of Cuesmes and Jemappes to the west of Mons. Louis Philippe's division sustained heavy casualties as it attacked through a wood, retreating in disorder. Louis Philippe rallied a group of units, dubbing them the Battalion of Mons, and pushed forward along with other French units, finally overwhelming the outnumbered Austrians. Events in Paris undermined the budding military career of Louis Philippe. The incompetence of Jean-Nicolas Paca, the new Girondist appointee, left the Army of the North almost without supplies. Soon thousands of troops were deserting the army. Louis Philippe was alienated by the more radical policies of the Republic. After the National Convention decided to put the deposed king to death, Louis Philippe's father, by then known as Philippe Égalité, voted in favor of that act. Louis Philippe began to consider leaving France. Louis Philippe was willing to stay in France to fulfill his duties in the army, but he was implicated in the plot. Dumouriez had planned to ally with the Austrians, march his army on Paris, and restore the Constitution of 1791. Dumouriez had met with Louis Philippe on the 22nd of March 1793 and urged his subordinate to join in the attempt. With the French government falling into the reign of terror, he decided to leave France to save his life. On the 4th of April, Dumouriez and Louis Philippe left for the Austrian camp. They were intercepted by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Nicolas Davout, who had served at Jemappes with Louis Philippe. As Dumouriez ordered the colonel back to the camp, some of his soldiers cried out against the general, now declared a traitor by the National Convention. Shots rang out as they fled towards the Austrian camp. The next day, Dumouriez again tried to rally soldiers against the convention. However, he found that the artillery had declared for the Republic, leaving him and Louis Philippe with no choice but to go into exile. At the age of 19, Louis Philippe left France. It was some 21 years before he again set foot on French soil. Exile. The reaction in Paris to Louis Philippe's involvement in Dumouriez's treason inevitably resulted in misfortunes for the Orléans family. Philippe Égalité spoke in the National Convention, condemning his son for his actions, asserting that he would not spare his son, much akin to the Roman consul Brutus and his sons. However, letters from Louis Philippe to his father were discovered in transit and were read out to the convention. Philippe Égalité was then put under continuous surveillance. Shortly thereafter, the Girondists moved to arrest him and the two younger brothers of Louis Philippe, Louis Charles and Antoine Philippe. The latter had been serving in the army of Italy. The three were interned in Fort Saint-Jean in Marseille. Meanwhile, Louis Philippe was forced to live in the shadows, avoiding both pro-republican revolutionaries and legitimist French émigré centers in various parts of Europe and also in the Austrian army. He first moved to Switzerland under an assumed name, and met up with the Countess of Genlis and his sister Adelaide at Schaffhausen. From there they went to Zurich, where the Swiss authorities decreed that to protect Swiss neutrality, Louis Philippe would have to leave the city. They went to Zug, where Louis Philippe was discovered by a group of émigrés. It became quite apparent that for the ladies to settle peacefully anywhere, they would have to separate from Louis Philippe. He then left with his faithful Valley Baudouin for the heights of the Alps, and then to Basel, where he sold all but one of his horses. They were refused entry to a monastery by monks who believed them to be young vagabonds. Another time, he woke up after spending a night in a barn to find himself at the far end of a musket, confronted by a man attempting to keep away thieves. Throughout this period, he never stayed in one place more than 48 hours. The school, owned by a Monsieur Jost, was in Reichenau, a village on the Upper Rhine, across from Switzerland. His salary was 1,400 francs and he taught under the name Monsieur Chabot. He had been at the school for a month when he heard the news from Paris. His father had been guillotined on the 6th of November 1793 after a trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Travels after Louis-Philippe left Reichenau, he separated the now 16-year-old Adelaide from the Countess of Genlis, who had fallen out with Louis-Philippe. Adelaide went to live with her great-aunt the Princess of Conti at Fribourg, then to Bavaria and Hungary and, finally, to her mother who was exiled in Spain. Louis-Philippe travelled extensively. He visited Scandinavia in 1795 and then moved on to Finland. For about a year, he stayed in Muonio, a remote village at the northern end of the Gulf of Bothnia, living in the rectory under the name Müller as a guest of the local Lutheran vicar. Louis-Philippe also visited the United States for 4 years, staying in Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. In Boston, he taught French for a time and lived in lodgings over what is now the Union Oyster House, Boston's oldest restaurant. During his time in the United States, Louis-Philippe met with American politicians and people of high society, including George Clinton, John J. Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington. His visit to Cape Cod in 1797 coincided with the division of the town of Eastham into 2 towns, one of which took the name of Orleans, possibly in his honor. During their sojourn, the Orleans princes traveled throughout the country, visiting as far south as Nashville and as far north as Maine. The brothers were even held in Philadelphia briefly during an outbreak of yellow fever. Louis-Philippe is also thought to have met Isaac Snow of Orleans, Massachusetts, who had escaped to France from a British prison hulk during the American Revolution. In 1839, while reflecting on his visit to the United States, Louis-Philippe explained in a letter to Guizot that his 3 years there had a large influence on his later political beliefs and judgments when he became king. In Boston, Louis-Philippe learned of the coup of 18 Fructidor and of the exile of his mother to Spain. He and his brothers then decided to return to Europe. They went to New Orleans, planning to sail to Havana and thence to Spain. This, however, was a troubled journey, as Spain and Great Britain were then at war. While in Louisiana in 1798, they were entertained by Julien Poydras in the town of Pointe Coupée. They sailed for Havana in an American corvette, but the ship was stopped in the Gulf of Mexico by a British warship. The British seized the 3 brothers, but took them to Havana anyway. Unable to find passage to Europe, the 3 brothers spent a year in Cuba, until they were unexpectedly expelled by the Spanish authorities. They sailed via the Bahamas to Nova Scotia, where they were received by the Duke of Kent, son of King George III and later father of Queen Victoria. Louis Philippe struck up a lasting friendship with the British royal. Eventually, the brothers sailed back to New York, and, in January 1800, they arrived in England, where they stayed for the next 15 years. Marriage. In 1808, Louis Philippe proposed to Princess Elizabeth, daughter of King George III of the United Kingdom. His Catholicism and the opposition of her mother Queen Charlotte meant the princess reluctantly declined the offer. In 1809, Louis Philippe married Princess Maria Amalia of Naples and Sicily, daughter of King Ferdinand IV of Naples and Maria Carolina of Austria. They had the following 10 children. Bourbon Restoration. After the abdication of Napoleon, Louis Philippe, known as Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, returned to France during the reign of his cousin Louis XVIII. At the time of the Bourbon Restoration, Louis Philippe had reconciled the Orleans family with Louis XVIII in exile, and was once more to be found in the elaborate royal court. However, his resentment at the treatment of his family, the cadet branch of the House of Bourbon under the ancient regime, caused friction between him and Louis XVIII, and he openly sided with the liberal opposition. Louis Philippe was on far friendlier terms with Louis XVIII's brother and successor, Charles X, who acceded to the throne in 1824, and with whom he socialized. However, his opposition to the policies of Villars and later of Jules de Polignac caused him to be viewed as a constant threat to the stability of Charles's government. This soon proved to be to his advantage. King of the French. In 1830, the July Revolution overthrew Charles X, who abdicated in favor of his 10-year-old grandson, Henry, Duke of Bordeaux, and, naming Louis Philippe Lieutenant General du Royaume, charged him to announce to the popularly elected Chamber of Deputies his desire to have his grandson succeed him. Louis Philippe did not do this, in order to increase his own chances of succession. As a consequence, because the Chamber was aware of Louis Philippe's liberal policies and of his popularity with the masses, they proclaimed Louis Philippe, who for 11 days had been acting as the regent for his small cousin, as the new French king, displacing the senior branch of the House of Bourbon. Charles X and his family, including his grandson, went into exile in Britain. The young ex-king, the Duke of Bordeaux, who, in exile, took the title of Comte de Chambord, later became the pretender to the throne of France and was supported by the Legitimists. Louis Philippe was sworn in as King Louis Philippe I on the 9th of August 1830. Upon his accession to the throne, Louis Philippe assumed the title of King of the French, a title already adopted by Louis XVI in the short-lived Constitution of 1791. Linking the monarchy to a people instead of a territory was aimed at undercutting the legitimist claims of Charles X and his family. By an ordinance he signed on 13 August 1830, the new king defined the manner in which his children, as well as his beloved sister, would continue to bear the surname d'Orléans, and the arms of Orléans, declared that his eldest son, as Prince Royal, would bear the title Duke of Orléans, that the younger sons would continue to have their previous titles, and that his sister and daughters would only be styled Princesses of Orléans, not of France. In 1832, his daughter, Princess Louise Marie, married the first ruler of Belgium, Leopold I, King of the Belgians. Their children included Leopold II of Belgium and Empress Carlota of Mexico. Assassination attempts. Louis Philippe survived 7 assassination attempts. On 28 July 1835, Louis Philippe survived an assassination attempt by Giuseppe Mario Fieschi and 2 other conspirators in Paris. During the King's annual review of the Paris National Guard commemorating the Revolution, Louis Philippe was passing along the Boulevard du Temple, which connected Place de la République to the Bastille, accompanied by three of his sons, Orleans, the Duke of Nemours and the Prince de Joinville, and numerous staff. Fieschi, a Corsican ex-soldier, attacked the procession with a weapon he built himself, a volley gun that later became known as the Machine Infernal, this consisting of 25 gun barrels fastened to a wooden frame that could be fired simultaneously. The device was fired from the third level of N-50 Boulevard du Temple, which had been rented by Fieschi. A ball only grazed the king's forehead. 18 people were killed, including Lieutenant Colonel Riusec of the 8th Legion, together with 8 other officers, Marshal Mortier and Colonel Raffet, General Gerard, Captain Villet, General La Chasse de Verny, a woman, a 14-year-old girl, and 2 men. A further 22 people were injured. The king and the princes escaped essentially unharmed. Horace Vernet, the king's painter, was ordered to make a drawing of the event. Several of the gun barrels of Fieschi's weapon burst when it was fired. He was badly injured and was quickly captured. He was executed by guillotine together with his 2 co-conspirators the following year.